Okay, good morning, everyone. Today is October 18th, 2023. This is an MSMCP Zoom event on flood map updates and the state model bylaw. I chose to work with Eric on getting this Zoom scheduled because I think a lot of us are in the midst of getting some flood zone, I should say flood map updates. So Eric's going to give us a great talk on that in a minute, but let me introduce Eric Carlson, who is an environmental engineer for DCR's Flood Hazard Management Program. He has worked in the capacity since 1990. He provides technical assistance and training on flood mapping issues, regulatory requirements, and floodplain management in general. Audience include community officials, consultants, developers, builders, and the general public. The FHMP, which stands for the Flood Hazard Management Program, exists through a cooperative agreement with FEMA to act as the state coordinating agency for the National Flood Insurance Program. So welcome, Eric, to our Zoom today, and we're eager to hear your presentation. And Eric, just before you start, perhaps we can talk about how people should ask questions. So would it be best if people just wrote in the chat sort of questions, and maybe if you switch topics, if you want to pause and I can read over questions, that might be an option.
Sure, we can do that. It would be difficult for me to keep track of what's in the chat, so if you can do that, I think that would be helpful.
Happy to help you with that.
Glad to do that. And I will start by sharing my screen. Whoop, I'm trying to share my screen. And I tested this beforehand, so it ought to work.
Yep, we're seeing your slide deck.
I think I have to make it into a slide. There it is. That's
perfect.
Better.
Yep, we see it.
Oh, I'll get started. I have to move a couple things around here. Okay, so I will be talking about flood mapping updates, and to include, like it says there on the screen, updates that are currently in progress right now, the process for flood mapping updates, community requirements, and the state model bylaw. So let's see. Pardon me, but this is going to take some getting used to. I got to get back into PowerPoint.
No problem. We've all been there.
Okay, so I think I'm back in PowerPoint. Okay, I just have to get used to how this works. Okay, so I want to start off by talking about the watershed. All studies right now are being conducted by watershed, and the watershed that are being used, the watersheds that are being used are the HUC 8 watersheds. And I bring this up because probably the most common question or comment that I get from people when I send out information on the mapping updates is, how come you're saying I'm in this watershed? I'm not in that one, I'm in the other one. Because right now I'm working on the Charles watershed update, and the Charles HUC 8 watershed is a very extensive watershed that includes a lot of smaller watersheds, and most people are more familiar with the smaller watersheds that are more familiar to them. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the HUC 8 watershed. That HUC means hydrologic unit codes, just in case anyone didn't know that. And the HUC watersheds are vary from two-digit hydrologic unit codes up to 12-digit. The two-digit HUC watersheds are enormous. There are 22 of them in the nation, and they describe entire regions. And I won't read the whole slide to you. The 8-digit HUC 8 watershed, they're described here as subbasins, and just to give you an idea, this is a slide from a USGS presentation. And here is, I'm going to use the Charles as an example. I'll be talking about the other watersheds and studies that are ongoing in the other watersheds as well. And I'm going to be talking more in a general sense. This is not a presentation just about the Charles watershed, but because I've been working on the Charles watershed, I have a lot of this information available to me. So what you see there on the screen is the Charles Huck 8 watershed, and you can see it's very extensive, and it includes a lot of areas that you wouldn't normally think of as being in the Charles watershed. If you know where the Charles River is, this watershed, the Huck 8 watershed, goes north all the way up to and including Newburyport. It includes all of the Boston Harbor area and areas south of Boston Harbor. It includes Hull and Cohasset. And then it includes also the area you might think of as the Charles watershed, you know, Boston and Newton, and extending all the way out into Millis, and including Worcester County. There are a couple communities in Worcester County that are in this watershed. Anyway, this might be the biggest one that we have in the state. It has, as you can see on the screen there, it has 98 cities and towns, and includes communities in 6 different counties. Now, the slide before, I said studies are performed by watershed. They're published by county, and all new studies are published by county. So if you are in a community that has mapping that's been developed in the last probably 12 years or so, you have more than likely a county-wide map. Right now in Massachusetts, all counties have county-wide mapping except for Berkshire County, Franklin County, Hampshire County, and the northern half of Worcester County. Communities in those counties and part of Worcester County still have community-based mapping. So for instance, the city of Fitchburg has the Fitchburg flood insurance rate map and the Fitchburg flood insurance study. Whereas if you're in Suffolk County, if you're in Boston, you have the Suffolk County flood insurance rate map, and that would apply to all communities in that county. That's true, like I said, of all the other counties besides the ones I just mentioned. So even though the studies right now that are underway are being performed by watershed, when they become effective, they will be the countywide flood insurance rate map and flood insurance study. Those will be getting updated, and those will have new dates. So there's not going to be any such thing as a Charles watershed flood insurance rate map, just as an example. Again, so there's your Huck 8 Charles watershed. Just here's a kind of a blow up of that same picture from the previous slide. It's a little bit easier to see it. And, you know, this picture includes some of the smaller watersheds that some people might be more familiar with. There are smaller watersheds still, and I want to just point out that if you're interested in looking at what watershed, what Huck 8 watershed your community is in, and you're interested in finding out, you know, whether there's a mapping update taking place or what the status of that mapping is, well, you can look up what watershed you're in, what Huck 8 watershed you're in on Mass Mapper. And I'm just going to stop share and change my screen so I can show you that. And where am I? Okay, So I think we should be looking at Mass Mapper. I'm in another screen.
Yep.
So if I did this right, okay. Thank you, Michelle. So what I've already done up here in search for layer, I typed in Huck and I selected NRCS Huck 8. I already put the layer on, so it's already there. In order to see this a little bit better, so you can determine what watershed your community is in, you click on the map here and you highlight the watershed you want. And here I've highlighted the Charles. So you can then zoom in, find your community, and I've used Lincoln as an example a few different times because I've gone over a lot of this stuff when I spoke to Michelle earlier. So I had a lot of this stuff ready. So town of Lincoln, for instance, you can see it's in more than one watershed. So town of Lincoln is here. I have the Charles highlighted, but you can click over here and see that it's also in the Concord. So, and I think it might also be in the Merrimack. So, right now, there are studies underway in both the Charles and the Merrimack. I'm working with any community that is at least partly in the Charles, and my supervisor, Joy, is going to be working with Merrimack communities. Any community that's in both will be working with me. So that's how that works. Another thing, because we have a lot of mapping updates underway at the same time, FEMA is also going out of their way to make sure that communities that are on the boundary, like Lincoln here in more than one watershed, only have to update their local regulations once. So the way that should work is when these maps become effective, Middlesex County should only be updated one time for both of those mapping updates. And I'll explain that a little bit later, a little bit more in detail as I get a little bit further into this presentation. So anyway, that's how you can use Mass Mapper to determine what watershed, and in particular, which of the Huck 8 watersheds your community is in. I'm going to stop sharing and go back to my PowerPoint. Okay. So here we are again. So that's where you can get that information on Mass Mapper. So here are the watersheds, and I made an effort to include all of the Huck 8 watersheds that you will find in Massachusetts. The first column, I labeled it as close to effective. I don't think FEMA actually uses that terminology. That's my terminology. Close to effective, well, it's self-explanatory. The Charles, I said before, has 6 counties that are affected by that watershed update. But anyone in the Charles should have gotten a message from me recently saying that most of the counties in the Charles are not going to go effective right away. Communities in Suffolk County and Plymouth County will likely get what's called a letter of final determination this coming January. And those maps will become effective in those 2 counties 6 months from the date of the letter of final determination. So Suffolk County and Plymouth County Charles watershed will be effective, we believe, next July, very likely. Now, the Merrimack and the Nashua are likely going, and likely also the Blackstone. The Merrimack, Nashua, and Blackstone are likely going to get we believe, a letter of final determination next next January, and by that I mean January 2025, which would mean those maps would become effective in July 2025. Some other mapping updates that are in progress, you can see there, Middle Connecticut, Connecticut, Lower Connecticut, and the rest of them. I won't read them all to you. You can see that for yourself. And currently, there are no studies underway in Middle Hudson, Concord, Narragansett, Cape Cod, and Quinnebog. Now, Cape Cod watershed was updated in 2021, so that's why they're not being studied again. They were very recent. Quinnebog was updated this year. Their maps became effective in June of 2023. So that's why there are no studies right now underway in those last two watersheds. Now I'm going to stop sharing and go back again to another. No, here we go. So there's Mass Mapper, and this is a status map. This is FEMA's status map. This is a website that is not available to the public, but it's one that I use, and it just shows in a graphic way studies that are underway right now in Massachusetts. As I mentioned, down here, the unshaded areas, kind of gray areas, are the places that are not currently under restudy. So you have the Cape Cod watershed, which includes Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. You have the Narragansett in there. You have the Concord. You have the Quinnebog. Like I said, Quinnebog was just restudied. And way over here, you have these two little pieces. That is the, what did I call that? The Middle Hudson, or whatever that was in the column of not being restudied. Everything else is under, in some way, being restudied. The ones that are a shade of green, those are the ones that are getting closer to being effective. You have in the Charles watershed, Plymouth County and Suffolk County, and then you have Merrimack and the Nashua watersheds. And all the ones in blue, they don't yet have preliminary mapping out. There are different, there's a color coding over here. They have preliminary mapping that's about to come out, or the preliminary mapping that's still in process of being produced. So this is where I get all of my information. FEMA makes that available to me. So if people have questions about their watershed, here's where I go to get that information. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. Okay. So this is what I just showed you. So this is the mapping status. And I just want to go over the basic timeline. I took this next slide from a USGS presentation. USGS right now is acting as mapping contractor for several of the studies that are underway, including the Charles, the Merrimack, the Nashua, and the Blackstone. And they do a good job, and they do good presentations and provide a lot of good information. Now, this whole process from start to finish, the mapping update process, from the time it starts until the time that those maps become effective, is usually in the neighborhood of 5 years. For the Charles, I think it's been about 8 years so far, honest to goodness. I believe it started in 2015. But the process starts with what they call a discovery meeting. The discovery meeting is a meeting with all of the affected communities in the watershed, where it's attended by FEMA, it's attended by the mapping contractor. In this case, that would have been USGS. And They encourage communities to attend these meetings. Typically, before the meeting, they blanket the community with invitations. They send invitations out by email to chief elected official, city or town manager, planning, conservation, building, engineering, emergency management, all as applicable. And they, as many people as they can come up with contact information for. And then they ask the communities, what problems do you want us to look at with the flood mapping in your community? It's kind of like airing of grievances. You know, everybody tells FEMA how bad their maps are and what things they want to have restudied. Now, of course, from a practical standpoint, FEMA cannot restudy everything. So they take all the information that they gather from the discovery meeting and they set priorities and they decide what rivers, what reaches of rivers, what water bodies are going to be studied in detail. Now, there are a few different things that will happen to the floodplain areas in a community. A detailed restudy involves updated hydrologic study and an updated hydraulic study, and those are applied to updated topography. Now, things that are not studied in detail will still change or can still change because FEMA will do what they call a digital uplift or redelineation, which means they take the existing flood study information and they apply it to updated topography. So even if something isn't studied in detail, it may still change based on that updated topography. And they also do with unnumbered A zones. If you're familiar with unnumbered A zones, they're those areas that are identified as 100-year floodplain, but they don't have flood elevations associated with them. For the newer mapping, they are doing what they're calling base level engineering, which is approximate hydrologic and hydraulic analysis, again, applied to updated topography. So those unnumbered A zones may very well end up looking different. They're not studied in detail. They still won't have flood elevation information, but they very often are going to end up looking different. All that takes place during this engineering phase, if you can see my cursor. So you have discovery, then you have the engineering phase. Then at some point in time, after the engineering is completed, they produce what are called work maps. When they have work maps developed, they again have another meeting. And these meetings used to be done in person, but they're mostly now done remotely because we do most of that sort of thing remotely now. But when they have work maps developed, they will have a work map meeting. Again, they will invite the communities and they invite as many different departments from every community as they can. And they have a work map meeting. They present those work maps. They ask communities to look at the work maps and to identify any problems with the work maps. They take the information they get from the work maps and they produce preliminary flood insurance rate maps and preliminary flood insurance study. So this process from discovery to work maps to preliminary flood insurance maps, that's going to be several years right there. When they have preliminary maps available, I didn't say this about the work maps, but when they do have work maps available, those aren't public. Those are provided to communities, and communities are asked not to make them public because they're not even close to effective. And this can cause problems because if they're like posted on somebody's website, people sometimes will misunderstand them and say, oh my gosh, what is that? I'm in a floodplain now. So they're way too rough to be making public. Preliminary maps are made public. They're made public and they're posted on FEMA's Map Service Center. So they're there for people to look at and to see what changes are likely to happen. The preliminary maps, like the name suggests, are not yet effective, but once the preliminary maps are out, at some point, oh, there's another meeting. It's called a CCO meeting, and you can see that on the timeline, and it says Consultation Coordination Officer meeting. It's funny because CCO, I looked up that acronym, and I found in FEMA documents 2 different definitions of that same term. So I'll go with Consultation Coordination Officer for now, but there's another one that they use for some reason. Anyway, those meetings have taken place for the Charles and also for the Merrimack and the Nashua. Those only happen after the preliminary mapping is available. There is an appeals period in that time frame too. The appeal period lasts, it's 90 days, and there's an appeals period underway right now for the watersheds that I mentioned, the Charles, Merrimack, and Nashua. 90-day appeals period. After that 90-day period is over, there's they have to resolve any appeals and any comments that they receive. Eventually, what will happen is once everything is in some sense ready to go, I mentioned this before, they issue a letter of final determination, or LFD, and the maps become effective 6 months from the date of the LFD. So I made a slide here that kind of summarizes that whole thing. You start with discovery, you get the information about what's going to be studied. The engineering that's necessary takes place, work maps are developed, more comments, more input from community happens when the work maps are out. Then you have preliminary firm flood insurance rate map and FIS flood insurance study. Those are available to the public. You have an appeals period. Once all appeals are resolved, you have a letter of final determination. And 6 months from that date, you have the maps become effective. So I mentioned this before, but I thought it was worth putting on a slide here. Here are the different things that will happen during the process. You have detailed analysis for some of the rivers within the watershed. You have redelineation to the water bodies that are not being studied in detail, but that have been studied before. And then the unnumbered A zone, where there's no BFE, they do the base level engineering, and everything is applied to new topography. So viewing the preliminary mapping, I'm going to go out to another screen again because it's always helpful to do. So, and here is FEMA's Map Service Center. Here is Map Service. Whoop. Okay. So here is the Map Service Center, and I'm trying to find the screen I want. Here's the one. Here's the one I want. So you want to view the preliminary mapping for your community. You can start here at the Map Service Center. You can hit Search All Products, which I just did. It'll give you drop-down menus. So you pick what's applicable to you. And I'm just, again, going to use Lincoln for an example. So here we go. So here's your search results. First thing you might want to do is, if you're not familiar with the panel numbers in your community, you might want to look here first at effective products and firm panels. This will list all the firm panels that are effective in your community. So here in Lincoln, I think there are 11 or so. Anyway, I'm not going to count them. But you go here, you look at the firm panels that are effective in your community. And once you go there, you can open up the panel by hitting over here where it says download. It should open it up into the same screen. I'm just going to open up panel number 379. I think it takes a little bit longer because I'm on Zoom at the same time as I'm trying to do this. But
and Eric, maybe while you're waiting for it to upload, you can tell us what the letter F versus E means.
Okay. Well, you notice that the panel numbers that have the suffix E are dated 2010. That was the date of the first Middlesex County flood insurance rate map, 2010. So all of the panels that were issued in 2010 have the suffix E. Every subsequent suffix means an update that's taken place since the original panel came out. So panel 389, all the rest of them were updated in 2014 as part of another mapping update. And for instance, there's going to be another mapping update, obviously, because of the Charles watershed update. So all of the panels that are updated will move up again. So if 393E is updated, that will become F, 393F, 389F. If that's updated, that'll become 389G, for instance. And I want to, okay. So you can open the panel like that, and I'm actually not going to. I'm going to close that. And I hope I can do this without.
It's kind of paused on our end. The download looks like you have a spinning circle, but hopefully that will relieve itself.
Okay. Yeah.
And I bring up the letter simply because when Eric goes into the preliminary maps as he's discussed, I would take all those panel numbers and write them down. Then when you look at preliminary, you know exactly which panel numbers to look for, but the letter will be slightly different.
Okay. So I'm not going to open that other panel. I was hoping what I can show you here is I showed you can, using the effective panels, you can know what panels are effective in your community. Then you can go down to preliminary products. These are listed for the whole county. So it's going to be like a lot of other panels that aren't effective, that aren't applicable to your community, but you can go here and you can find the panel you want, like 379, and open that. That should actually, no, okay. I'm going to see if I can open this into the same. And you can see the effective panel is 379G, like Michelle just said. Do you see the panel that I just opened?
We
It
do.
should have opened, okay. So I'm just gonna leave that there and try to figure out which. Okay, this is what I want. So here's the town of Lincoln. And this is the effective panel I'm now looking at. You can do here on the Map Service Center, what I did here is I just did a search for Lincoln, Mass. And this is a locator map that it'll give you. You can hit go to NFHL viewer there, and it'll take you here. And I'm just having you hit OK, and it'll go here, and you get that out of the way. So this is the same. This is panel 379. This is the effective panel 379. And here's what I want to show you. How you can tell the difference between what changed from the effective mapping to the preliminary mapping. What you have here is you can see panel 379 down here in the lower left corner. You see this orange shaded area. If you look at the legend, that will tell you that the orange shaded area, that's 2% annual chance flood hazard, or what we call 500-year floodplain. It's also called a shaded zone X area. Now, I had previously opened the preliminary panel, and here you can see on the preliminary panel, the lower right-hand corner is zone AE. And is that big enough for you to see, Michelle?
Yeah, it's a small screen. It's just a small portion of Flint's Pond, but yes, we're seeing the zone AE, the blue.
Okay.
This map is blue.
So that's one way that you can tell that this has changed. There is another way that's a little bit easier. There's a product that is available to everybody. So this is a link that one of the links Michelle is going to provide to you, because I'm going to provide all the links to her. And it's called the Flood Map Change Viewer. And if you click on that, you get the welcome screen. Welcome to the Flood Change Map Viewer. I already zoomed in to where I want to look at, which is right here. So again, we're on panel 379, and you can see this lower right-hand corner is shaded, that sort of shade of yellow. If you go to the legend here, and I'm opening the legend. I'm trying to open the legend. It's not opening. Okay, I'll tell you what the legend says. For some reason, it's not opening. This always happens.
It looks like it might be on the bottom of your screen. I'm seeing the legend with some arrows.
Oh, you know what? You're right. I didn't see it because the Zoom window was on top of it. Okay, thank you, Michelle. Okay, so if you look at the color coding in this legend, you see this yellow shade, special flood hazard area increase. So what I showed you before on those other two panels I opened, this is the new preliminary panel that shows a zone AE. And let's see, this being the effective panel that shows that as a zone X, or 500-year floodplain. Here's where you can, without opening up all the different maps, the effective maps and the preliminary maps, you can open up this flood map change viewer, and you can see for every panel where you're adding special flood hazard area. I think that's a really good tool. It's kind of new, and I'm glad they have that now, because that's another one of those frequently asked questions that I get. how do we tell what the difference is between the maps we have and the maps that are proposed? Here's another way. I just want to point out one more thing. Under the preliminary product, actually under the effective products, it'll have the firm panels. You'll have the FIS report. You also have the GIS files here. If you have GIS in your community, if you know how to use it, or somebody else in your community knows how to use it, you have the GIS files that you can apply to your GIS, and you have them for both the effective and down here in preliminary products. If you scroll down far enough, you actually have the preliminary database, which is, again, the GIS files for these preliminary mapping. So I'm going to go back to my other screen. So I showed you how to do that for using the Map Service Center. You can open up your existing files, your effective flood insurance rate maps. You can then compare them to the preliminary mapping, or you can use that flood map changes viewer. There's another mapping product called Change Since Last Firm, and I think I provided those panels to you, Michelle. I can go over those also if anybody wants to. I think I'm getting close to the end. We can do that in the question section if anybody wants to see. There are static panels. It's not a viewer like I just showed you. There are static panels that are available that correspond to the flood insurance rate map panels that show it's a different color coding, but they show the same thing. They show you what's been added for special flood hazard area. Special flood hazard area, by the way, is another term for 100-year floodplain. So it'll show you any 100-year floodplain added and any 100-year floodplain that's been removed. I can provide those to you if you want. They're not readily available to the public. They're something I can get on USGS's site, or if you like, you can have access to that site. You'd have to contact them and ask permission to go on that site. I can give you contact information for doing that. Map adoption and state model bylaw. Okay, when maps are updated, communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance are required to adopt that new mapping by the effective date of the new mapping. So right now, with the Charles watershed as the example, 5 communities in Plymouth County and all 4 communities in Suffolk County will be getting new mapping next June or July. We don't know the exact date yet. So all of those communities are going to have to update their local regulation to adopt those maps prior to the effective date of the mapping. Now, most local regulations are going to be zoning regulations, but not all of them. Some communities have their floodplain regulations, local floodplain regulations, in a different local regulation. Sometimes it's a wetland regulation or a Board of Health regulation or general bylaws. Sometimes they have different things in different bylaws. So they have some things in the general bylaws, subdivision regulations. Whatever regulation is applicable in a community must be updated to adopt those new maps. Now, here's the other thing that's happening at the same time. Massachusetts has a model bylaw, and most communities have their local regulations modeled after our model bylaw. Our model bylaw has everything in it that a National Flood Insurance Program community must have in their local regulations. Some communities have additional things too, but our model bylaw has all of the things at a minimum that a community must have to be compliant with National Flood Insurance Program standards. We updated our model bylaw in 2020, and we also made a couple updates in 2021. So communities updating their regulations have to do two things. They have to update to adopt the new mapping, but they also have to update to become compliant with our updated model bylaw. So I'm just going to talk a little bit. I'm going to put the model bylaw on the screen and talk a little bit about what's different. And with any luck, I'll be able to, here we go. With any luck. Okay, so where the heck? Okay, first I want to show you, this is the website for my program, the Flood Hazard Management Program. You can come to this website and you can find the model bylaw here, or I can send it to you. I send it out anytime I send out correspondence on this subject. I usually send out a copy of the model bylaw, and I'll just open up the model bylaw here and talk about it a little bit. Model bylaw, it has introduction and some explanations. I'm going to go right to section 2, which is everything a community needs to have. Now, some of these things you already have because our older version of the model bylaw was pretty complete, but FEMA told us we needed to add some things. So communities that updated their local regulations, like for instance, Lincoln would have updated their local regulations in 2014, which was the last time they had a mapping update. Well, they were compliant with the model bylaw that we had in place at that time in 2014. We've changed it, so a community that updated the previous version of the model bylaw will now have to add some things. Now, stated purpose, we've had that all along. Use of FEMA maps to define the floodplain and define the area where the bylaw is effective. That's been there all along. One change that we've made, and I'll go down to countywide. One change we've made, previously, we required that communities list all panels. We don't require that anymore. Communities can just make reference to the countywide map. So that's at the discretion of the communities. Some communities decide that they want to continue listing all their panels. They think it's more descriptive, but that's up to the community. Designation of a floodplain administrator, that is new. We didn't require that before. FEMA said they want that designation in the bylaw. So that would be typically by title, not by name. So you wouldn't say Michelle is our floodplain bylaw, floodplain administrator. You'd say by title. So that way, if somebody moves to a different town, well, there is still a person designated. Now, that provides a point of contact for FEMA. So if FEMA wants to, interact with the community, they have a person, a person they can call and contact information that they can contact the community and do whatever they need to do. There are also some other duties that person would have, like signing different forms that FEMA requires, say, for instance, for an application for a letter of map amendment or letter of map revision, something like that. Permits are required for all proposed development. This is new. Assure that all necessary permits are obtained. That's new. Now, number 4 that's not to take the place of permitting you already require, like it's not going to take the place of a building permit or an order of conditions, but All development as defined has to have either a permit, a formal permit, or a review that is documented and approval under that review. Some of these things you might already have been doing, by the way, but maybe you just didn't have it formalized in your bylaw. Floodway encroachment is not a new thing. Neither is unnumbered A zones, requirements for unnumbered A zones. I'm just going to highlight the things that are new things. Recreational vehicles. Standards for recreational vehicles, that is a new thing. Watercourse alteration notification, that's not new. Requirement to submit new technical data is new. So if some project is undertaken within a community that might change flood characteristics, that data has to be provided to FEMA so they know about it, so they can change the mapping if necessary. Some standards for variances, okay? Variances to building code standards. Most communities don't issue those, but there are requirements here, basically administrative requirements that have to be met. Also, variances to your local bylaw. That's new. The last three here, 17, 18, and 19, abrogation, disclaimer, severability. Again, those are administrative things. You might already have those in your bylaw, but if you don't, you will need to add those. And then we list local enforcement here. Your zoning likely has enforcement provisions. So more than likely you already meet this requirement, but we listed that there just to make everyone understand that you will need to have enforcement provisions in place. You will have to be able to enforce these things in your bylaw. We didn't before require definitions, but we do require some of these definitions if applicable. Not all of them are applicable in every community, and it's noted here some of the things that may or may not be applicable in every community. So that is about what I was going to say about the bylaw, and I will just put my PowerPoint back up and whoops, there. So that's my contact information and also contact information for the folks I work with. Feel free to contact us. We pretty much all work on these same issues. So if you're in the Charles watershed, I will be working with you directly. If not, you can still call me. I can answer your questions more than likely. But I am done with this part of my presentation, and now I guess I can open up chat myself, maybe start looking at questions.
Yeah, and I can help with that too, Eric. I think one of the things that would be helpful too in terms of the resources you provide me to send out is maybe you could obviously take these contact info, add that and reference what watersheds
Yep.
each individual is responsible for, so that will help
Sure.
direct conservation agents in that manner. As Eric mentioned, and a couple people had requested in the chat, Eric will provide me with a list of resources to send out. So be sure your info is on that Google Doc that I did attach in the chat. I took attendance to see who was here, and there's actually several of you who are not on the RSVP sheet. So make sure you add your name and email address so we can get you that follow-up information. Happy to have you join us, of course. So that was a lot of the earlier chats, Eric. I had started the chat off by asking just a question, which I don't think I hope I might have missed it in your presentation, but for those of us who have had the FEMA issue the official appeal letter saying you have 90 days, Now, as we know, like in Charles River watershed, the actual firm maps adoption will be delayed until later in 2024. But does this affect the 90-day appeal period in any way?
It does not. The appeal period is still taking place as they described in those letters that each community received. So the appeals period is still taking place. It will end whenever it ends. It's going to be different for different counties. And then they'll go through the whole process of addressing, resolving the appeals, if any, and comments. And the letter of final determination is just going to be delayed by roughly a year.
Okay, which of course I did do a little celebratory dance when I heard it.
Yeah,
In terms of,
I did too.
part of the challenge with Lincoln, some of you might have this issue. So originally, these per maps panel numbers would be finalized sometime in like January. In Lincoln, our annual town meeting is March,
Yeah.
and so our warrant is needs to be finalized in January. So I was already stressing about how are we going to get these panel numbers known and put into the warrant in time for our town meeting. Well, two good things is it's all been delayed, so kick that can down till later. But also, Eric, and you probably told me before and it didn't sink in. It sounds like now we don't actually have to identify the panel numbers in our bylaw.
You don't have to list every panel number individually. We don't require that, and FEMA has agreed to accept that kind of description, reference to the county-wide flood insurance rate map. You will still need to know the date. You will still need to know the date of the flood insurance rate map and the date of the flood insurance study. And again, we don't know that till we know when the LFD is issued. Now, just addressing what you said about finalizing your warrant in January, I know that some other communities that I've worked with have warrants that close even earlier than that. I know of at least one that closes in November. And what they've done is they get their proposed bylaw amendments all put together, but they don't have a date in there. And they've told me they can add the date later. They tell me they can make some changes like that even after the warrant is finalized, So
Yeah,
I don't know if every community can do it the same way, but
I would think there's some ways. I mean, if it's obvious like this, I think there's gonna be some ways to work through that. So that is true. So that would help a little bit to know. Um, People are welcome to raise their real hand or they're put in the chat. The other question we did have in the chat, I think, is about the floodplain administrator, which again was like news news to
yeah.
me. That every town is going to be required to identify a floodplain administrator. And there was actually an email that went out through Alicia Galen with the Northeast Region Circuit Rider, DEP
Yep.
Circuit Rider, who was sending out a question, I think, from Linda Hansen, who was wondering about in each community who is being identified as the floodplain administrator. And Eric, I'll throw it to you first, and then I
Okay.
can also add some insights in terms of what you've heard towns are doing on that.
Okay. It varies from place to place, and I've worked with mapping updates before, and since we've had the model bylaw in place and including designation of floodplain administrator, I would say more than half the communities designate the building official, either building commissioner, inspector of buildings, as the floodplain administrator. And then the rest of the communities, it varies. Probably in second place would be conservation agent and town planner. Some communities have town engineer, and one or two even have like town manager. So
Yeah, or it could be maybe the zoning or planning administrator as well.
Mhm.
So this is something that when in Lincoln, I was tasked. We're a very small town, so we don't have a town engineer. I was tasked by the town administration to just see this letter that came from FEMA. on some map changes. And I was like, oh my God. And that's where Eric and Joy DePaul was super helpful. I reached out to them both and was like, how do I figure out what our floodplain numbers are, our panel numbers are? And they walked me through the information that Eric's did today, and Eric will send us links. Because the one thing I will also mention, because the question that was asked of me was, well, what's changed? And I'm like, I don't know what's changed. And first I had to figure out the panel numbers for Lincoln, got that. Then I was doing this compare and contrast, which was a pain. And then Eric did show me the changes since last data viewer, which was hugely helpful. The other thing to be aware of is in places where the flood zone elevation hasn't changed, which is many of us, I did notice in the proposed maps that the extent of the flood zone may be quite different than your effective maps right now. And that's because FEMA has now used LIDAR data, which is incredibly accurate. And this is, some of you might have gotten my MSMCP email blast about a month ago. I sent out this like news alert that 1-foot contours are now available on Mass Mapper, which is a huge help for all conservation agents to be aware of. If you don't have 1-foot contour data locally in your municipality on your GIS systems, you can get that on Mass Mapper now. And as a result of that more efficient contour information, FEMA has updated their maps. So the 100-year flood zone, or AE, may look very different on these proposed maps as than what they appear on the effective maps. And it could just be a result of you're still dealing with 252 feet above sea level. Maybe it's 152 feet above sea level. But the blob, the AE blob, has changed significantly in some of the places in Lincoln. So that's telling. Obviously it hasn't changed the elevation and they're just getting real data, but it may affect some of the projects coming forth that you're reviewing. And of course, quite honestly, it makes me realize for some of the current stuff, even though the proposed maps aren't effective now, it made me realize that I have to be very cautious when I'm reviewing wetland permits to make sure that we're really getting that true and accurate elevation data and confirming it. Because sometimes I do get a little lazy and I look at the GIS and I look at the AE blobs, and if it's not in that property, I don't sometimes go further. But really, when we are working with properties near these 100-year flood zones, we really should be asking for actual topographic information to confirm that in fact they're not in the AE. So there's my little tip for folks. And also, like, Lincoln's trying to decide who the floodplain administrator is going to be here. We're not quite sure who that will be yet, but I know, like in Wayland, Linda Hansen was identified, the conservation administrator there, as the floodplain administrator. And it does have obviously repercussions. That's additional work that someone's going to need to take on. Obviously, we are reviewing a lot of floodplain information already, but the floodplain model bylaw does have additional requirements that are not regulated under the Wetlands Protection Act. Hence why we need this zoning law. So there will be additional work and a skill set that anyone taking on the floodplain administrator role will need to sort of get up to speed on. On top of that, I think, Eric, and you mentioned this, that there is a new permitting process. Like I think there's a requirement that there's a new permit for under the floodplain model bylaw that will have to be reviewed and administered by the floodplain administrator.
Yes, permits will be required. Like I said, it could be a formal permit or it could just be a review process that is documented, but permits will be required for everything that's defined as development. And like I said, the definitions are now required to be in the bylaw. One of those definitions is development. And let me just, while I'm at it, put that back on my screen.
That's great because that was going to be my next question about definition for one of the things you had was agricultural facilities.
I don't think
Um,
that's one of our definitions. But you see development there, any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to building, other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation, and other stuff. So anything that falls into that category would require, whether you call it a permit like a floodplain development permit, or if you just require that review and document it, that would be required under this new state model bylaw. Um, some of the things that uh, that would apply to that may not have required permits before could include fences, could include retaining walls. Sometimes, depending on the height, sometimes they require a building permit. I think if it's 3 feet or less, it does not require a building permit. But a retaining wall, even a small retaining wall like that, could change flooding characteristics. In particular, in a floodway, if you're at all familiar with the floodway and how a floodway works. So, and a fence could also, depending on how a fence is constructed, a fence could be a debris trap, which could change, again, change flooding characteristics, in particular upstream of that fence, depending on how the fence is constructed. If it's a fence that allows water to flow through and it's not likely to trap debris, but something like a chain link fence, if the posts are set in concrete and if it is perpendicular to the direction of flow and it's in a floodway, well, that could have an effect on flood elevations. So some things like that would need to be reviewed and approved, or maybe not approved, depending on what kind of impact they would likely have.
well, on that note, Eric, I'm curious. Maybe you can scroll down on the floodplain model bylaw because I was writing notes about. Well, my notes said since the old model bylaw, the requirements have changed, and I listed a bunch of bullets. And there's one section that says permits are required for all proposed development,
Yeah.
and that is where I saw fences and
Okay.
placement of ag facilities. Um,
Okay. Let me see.
so permits, okay, maybe it was a little bit right there.
Okay.
Yes. So here it looks like development does mean proposed ag facilities and fences as well. Um, and I mentioned that because certainly under the Wetlands Protection Act, some agricultural activities are exempt from wetlands
Yep.
permitting. So technically, all these things, I think, under the Wetlands Protection Act, if you're doing work in the flood zone, should trigger some type of Wetland Protection Act review. Except for there's certain ag facilities that probably could, if the property was designated as land in agriculture, that means you can build things even if it's in a wetland resource area. So this is an interesting change that may slide through on like Concom not reviewing it, but now will require permit under the floodplain model bylaw.
It will require a permit or a review. Yes.
So that's just something to be aware of. A lot of these things obviously
I
already
know.
fall under WPA review, but and it's good that you're making a distinction between permitting or review. So what you're saying is it might not need to be a permit that has to go to a board and go through like an official public meeting, but there
Right.
still has to be an official.
Exactly how it works is up to each community, how they administer that.
Right, but this is a big deal. Like, I mean,
Yep.
I think it's a big deal. Like,
Yeah. And remember, all of this applies in the floodplain and doesn't necessarily apply everywhere.
think
So
yes, yeah. So we're still talking about a small amount, but I bet there's some cities out there.
I'm sure.
There's some communities out there that there's quite a bit of flood zone and there's quite a bit of work because there might be existing. It might be previously developed and they're going to be redeveloped. Those are
Oh yeah.
things that certainly I think some cities see all the time, and a separate permitting is going to be, or review is going to be required now. So with that, if I haven't freaked everyone out at this point, and again, I just want to reiterate that Joy and Eric are wonderful to work with. I called up, I emailed Eric, was like, can we do a Zoom and can you help me understand this? Because I'm such a visual learner. And even though I've been doing my job for 20 years, I really felt completely blindsided by some of these things. Because we're all trying to do so much. So Eric was great to set up a Zoom and just meet with me and kind of go through the basics. That's when I was like, we need to hold this for an MSMCP event. So do contact them. And I see John Keeley has a question.
So it's not actually a question. So things like the fences and whatnot, so those would probably require building permits, and those would not be permits that the Conservation Commission would necessarily have to worry about, but the inspector of buildings would have to deal with.
Very often this
bylaw.
would be true, but like I said, for instance, about retaining walls, I know I'm pretty sure about this. Retaining walls that are less than 3 feet in height would typically not require a building permit. And depending on the community, I don't think necessarily every fence would require a permit. So some places require and some don't.
But if it's required in your zoning bylaw and your floodplain is part of your zoning bylaw, right, then it requires a permit.
Right.
It does lead to a question on, we always sometimes see projects going through without Concom approval that, how, if you have a resident who wants to put up a little fence in their backyard, I could see some of these things just happening without them necessarily checking with the building official because their friend put up, you can put up a 5-foot fence, under most zoning laws, not necessarily flood zone, without a building permit. So making sure it's, I think, again, critical to talk to your building inspector and others to be like, there's certain things we just say all the time. If someone calls me and says, I have a 5-foot fence I want to put up, the building official might be like, oh yeah, you don't need a building permit unless it's 6 feet. So those are things that we have to put those exceptions, except if you're in a flood zone. And also check with Concom in case it's within the buffer zone. So there's sort of this really good example of why interdepartmental collaboration is so important with these kind of nuances, because I can totally see a resident not realizing they're building a little retaining wall in their backyard to flatten it, and it's all flood zone, and they're basically filling flood zone. Any other questions or comments?
Another thing, sheds under a certain size wouldn't normally require a building permit, but if you put that shed in a floodway, that would be a big problem because, well, floodways are more hazardous. They have higher velocity water, and an encroachment in a floodway would have to meet the floodway encroachment requirements. So that's why all of these things have to be reviewed by that floodplain administrator.
Yeah, and that comes back to the whole Wetland Protection Act and sheds too, that we've seen a number of problems where the shed might not need a building permit, but it's in the flood zone. It still has to be regulated under the Wetlands Protection Act. And how do you capture that and how do you constitute that? Is it important for residents to understand that some of these small accessory things they want to put in their backyard may trigger wetlands and floodplain review.
Karen, do you have a question?
Hi, Eric. Thanks. Thanks, Michelle, for setting this up. My question, just when you say floodway, is that synonymous with the 10-year flood elevation?
No.
Okay.
Floodway, the designated floodway is shown on your flood insurance rate maps. And I can share my screen again. Floodway, you'll find it under definitions.
Right. But it's not necessarily the 100-year floodplain either.
It is part of the 100-year floodplain, right, but it's not the whole 100-year floodplain. So here you see the definition: channel of a river, creek, or other water course, adjacent land areas that must be reserved in order to discharge the base flood without increasing the water surface elevation at all, by the way, not more than a designated height. That's how it's defined, and the floodway standard, which has been in our model bylaw forever. This is not one of the new things. Floodway standard, you cannot allow an encroachment in a floodway unless it's been demonstrated through hydrologic and hydraulic analysis that no result will increase anywhere in the community as a result of it. I'm going to see if I can find a floodway to show you. Oh, here's one. This is the effective map, and this is in Lincoln. It's a little hard to see, but here you have a water course, and you see that area there. That is the floodway. So the floodway is, it's the channel of the water course, plus maybe some areas. By definition, it's at least to the banks of that water course. Very often it extends outside of the water course, but that's the area that cannot be encroached upon without having that hydraulic analysis demonstrating no rise.
So
because of where it is.
Sorry. So do you get that by going to the map panel to get the elevation? I mean,
you can go to the panels right now. What I have on the screen, this is the map service center, the interactive part of the map service center. So you can go to the map service center and enter an address. It'll zoom into wherever in the community you are. And if there's floodplain or floodway, you'll see it there. So.
And it gives you the elevation, is that like?
Well, okay, so here's the map service center. So map service center will give you elevations. There is an elevation, but that's an approximate elevation. That is to the nearest foot, but it does give you, you can get exact elevations in two different ways. One is here, you can see a cross section. So at cross sections, they have exact elevations. This happens to be 207.0, but you can also refer to the flood insurance study for any place along a water course if it's studied in detail. And there are profiles in the back of the map, the flood insurance study, and you can use the cross sections as reference, but you can use those profiles to get exact elevations. But you can see the extent of the floodway itself on the map panels, or you can use the interactive viewer on the map service center.
So
Yeah.
Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are two elevations. The squiggledy line is the 100-year zone AE 100-year floodplain, so-called. But the floodway is defined in the floodway tables at the back of the FIS. And has a distinct is distinct in terms of elevation from the 100-year floodplain.
No, the floodway will have the same flood elevation as the 100-year floodplain, but in the floodway data tables, it'll give you two different elevations. One is the regulatory elevation that applies to that 100-year floodplain. The other elevation, if you remember the definition of floodway, it says that it defines it as the channel of the water course plus areas outside that cannot be encroached without increasing the elevation by a certain height. That's in the definition. And what they have in the floodway data tables is how much of an increase results from the encroachment that they do by modeling when they delineate the floodway. That increase is not actually allowed by regulation, but that's how much the water surface elevation would increase if they did encroach. Now, just as an example, it's hard to do this without a visual to show you, but if you watch my cursor, if what they do to delineate the floodway is by modeling, they encroach in this area that's not floodway, okay? So by modeling, all of this non-floodway is encroached. The elevation they give you in the floodway data table is how much the water surface elevation would increase if all of this were encroached. Do you follow me?
Nope, but but I just want to re-ask. I don't. It doesn't seem to me, based on even this illustration here, that the elevation associated, so if you were to overlay this with 1 foot LiDAR topo, that the elevation associated with the boundary of the floodway would be the same as the elevation associated with the boundary of the zone AE 100-year floodplain.
Okay.
The 100-year floodplain extends further laterally because it's higher up.
Okay, the boundary of the floodway is not defined by a ground elevation.
Correct. That's right.
Why. And the floodway itself does have the same flood elevation as the rest of the floodplain.
Right, because it will be
Okay.
carrying the same water during the same
Right,
flood event.
exactly.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we're on the same page there.
Right, but the boundaries, it's basically, the way I think of it is it's the inland equivalent of a V zone. It's
Well,
where water's going to be flowing fastest and hardest through a mostly defined channel. Though sometimes it'll be outside of the very visually apparent channel.
True. Let me just see if I can do something here.
Yeah. Well, and as you do that, I think to Karen's point, like when we are reviewing a project, a lot of it's based on elevation. Like if someone wants to build in the flood zone, it may be allowable with compensatory flood storage, but now I'm realizing, because I also thought, like Karen did, that the river itself was the floodway, and obviously it might go a little further. How do we as regulators actually determine if something's being proposed in the quote unquote floodway, because that would require a hydrologic assessment.
Yeah, I think you have to guesstimate based on where your project is on the map.
Thank you. I'm more confused.
Yeah. So the maps do show, very clearly these red and black cross-hatched areas that are the floodways, and at least in the Charles River around Newton, they're places that you wouldn't build. Anyway, it's the river. It's the immediate banks of the river. There are some surprisingly small streams, however, that have had floodways added, and they're so skinny and tiny. The only way that I knew that they were there was that I looked at the floodway tables and went, oh my gosh, it's incorporating a portion of this small stream. Then I went and zoomed in on the map and sort of went, oh yeah, there it is. So you really do sort of have to go, do a little backing and forthing. But I think to answer your question, Michelle and Eric, kick me under the table if I'm saying anything wrong here, you have to use the map for the floodway. That you can't just sort of go by LiDAR and usual topography.
Yes.
Okay.
The map shows you where that floodway is. Now, are you looking at a picture of a floodway schematic? Okay. I was hoping that I was able to do that. So let me see if I can explain that using, okay. So here is a floodway schematic shown along the cross section of a water course. And you see in here, you have your stream channel, and then you see your floodway, and you see the floodway fringe. How they delineate that floodway is by modeling, they encroach on that floodplain from both sides of the water course until, by modeling, you have that surcharge. Let me make it a little bigger so maybe you can see it better. So you see that surcharge, the water surface elevation increases in that modeling because they have encroached on that floodplain. Obviously, they're not doing that in real life, but once that elevation gets to, it's either 1 foot or in some cases, it's not as much as 1 foot. That's where they draw that line, okay? So they draw that line showing you the delineation of the floodway on the map. So that line there is based on how much they have to encroach from both sides before they get that surcharge of not more than 1 foot. Okay, that's how they do that. And what you're looking at, Jennifer, you mentioned in the floodway data table, they show 2 different elevations. The 2 different elevations are the flood elevation based on no encroachment. That's the regulatory elevation that you see on the map. And the other elevation is the elevation including that surcharge. Does that kind of make sense now?
So in theory, you could then go back to the map with that surcharge elevation and find the exact extent on the map based on a LiDAR level, of accuracy, line of topography.
That wouldn't show you the floodway boundary, though. What that would show is a bigger floodplain, because that surcharge would mean now they have a higher flood elevation. So what you would see was how big the floodplain would be if that encroachment.
Okay, so we should just use the maps with the
maps to delineate that floodway.
And remind people not to look at the floodway data tables because it will confuse them.
Oh, if you don't know what they're for, they're confusing. But if you do, I use the floodway data tables myself for different reasons. So I use them.
Wrapping Christmas gifts.
Oh.
Sorry.
This was useful, although a little confusing. But Eric, you did a great job explaining it. And Karen and Jen, you're raising a good point here on like some of this stuff is looking just at the map, and it sounds like it's a little bit of an approximation based on just the visual, where the visual blob of that floodway is. And these are 202 questions. I do want to go back to a couple 101 questions that are in the chat, just because it is 12:29, and I do try to be cautious about not going too far over our timeline. But someone asked about where they can find the model bylaw, the floodplain model bylaw, and Eric did go through that. I think it's on your flood plain management program website. Yep. And Eric will send me direct links, and I'll have that included in our resources afterwards. And then Imai just asked a question about Weston, about adoption timeline, and what the triggers are, because Weston's similar to Lincoln, where they're in 2 different watersheds. And I believe the answer on that particular question is because they're in the Charles, that they're also going to be delayed until late 2024. So that trumps kind of the review period if you're in 2 different watersheds, correct, Eric?
Right. What FEMA is trying to do with communities that are in 2 different watersheds, it might be the Charles and the Merrimack, or it might be the Merrimack and the Nashua. They want to have the LFD date be the same when those counties go effective. So whatever county you're in, that county should have the same LFD date for both of the watersheds that you're in. And that's the big reason why much of the Charles is being delayed. The communities that are going effective are, I mentioned Suffolk County. All 4 communities in Suffolk County are 100% in the Charles. So they can go effective without having any boundary issues. And Plymouth County has, there are no boundary issues with any other watersheds that are under restudy right now, but all the rest of the counties have boundary issues with other watersheds, and that's part of the reason that's been delayed.
Right. And interestingly, with Weston, Lincoln, both we're also part of the Suasco, the Sudbury, Aspet, Concord River watershed, and that was a big gray blob on your map. So that is not being updated at this point. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So like in Weston though, they're only in Suasco and Charles. So would that still affect, but that would still affect their adoption rate date because anything, Suasco is part of the Merrimack, isn't it?
Nope,
Oh, it's separate.
that is entirely separate.
Okay. But still in Weston, with it only sharing the watershed of the Suasco, they're still paused.
Right, because they have to do the whole county at the same time.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. So Imai, you got a few months to pause and wait on having to deal with this for Weston.
All right. Many thanks. Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Got it.
It's really complicated. This is why when Eric and I were Zooming like a month ago, I was like, oh my God, how do I get this all straight?
Can I, Eric, is there an easy introduction to the community rating system, the point system that sort of falls out of this, or is that another workshop?
That would be another workshop.
Okay.
I can send information or I can provide links to Michelle, and those can be provided to everybody. And just for everyone else's information, Community Rating System is a program within the National Flood Insurance Program where communities can have reduced flood insurance premiums within the community when they have higher regulatory standards within the community. So it's not as easy as I just made it sound. It's a lot of work, but I think in Massachusetts, about 30 or so communities get reduced flood insurance premiums because they are meeting higher standards.
Okay, that's good to know. And actually, you're seeing Joe Fontaine's hand raised. I'm remembering
Yep.
he had a great question in the chat that maybe, I'm assuming that's what he's going to be asking. But Joe, feel free to, unmute yourself and you can ask Eric.
Yeah,
directly.
so basically my question was, I saw in the model bylaw, it said, town shall adopt. So that term shall, I was just kind of wondering, is there regulatory context for requiring towns to adopt it into their bylaw?
Okay.
So I guess I was getting at, like, if municipalities participate in the NFIP program and adopt the new floodplain maps, are they then, by doing so, they're agreeing to adopting this bylaw?
If a community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, they are required to adopt the new mapping and define their floodplain district based on whatever the current effective mapping is. And like I said, FEMA Region 1 has determined that our previous model bylaw was missing a few things. So in order to be compliant with FEMA's requirements for participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, communities will need to update based on the state model bylaw, because the state model bylaw has everything in it that communities are required to have in order to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program.
Okay, so as far as determining exactly what is required of towns by opting into the NFIP program, is that publicly available information on the FEMA's website through the NFIP website?
Yeah, you can look up FEMA's regulations, and you should go to 44 CFR 60, and in particular 44 CFR 60.3. I will provide links to Michelle to help you find that, just in case you don't remember that.
I wrote it down.
Okay.
But that's good to know, because it was one of those things that you realize, if the towns don't do this, cities or towns don't do this, you could be really impacting residents who live in the flood zone in a big way. So
participation in the National Flood Insurance Program means that people within the community can purchase flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program.
Yeah, so that has huge consequences to our residents in flood zones, and especially now with bigger, intense storm events. I assume this also has to do with when there's these disasters, declared disasters, and getting FEMA funds. I don't know if that also has an impact.
There are certain types of funds that are not available to communities that do not participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. I want to be clear that that is not a broad and sweeping statement that no disaster money is available. That's not true. Most types of disaster assistance will still be available, but certain types of disaster assistance, in particular, mitigation grants in particular, but I can provide that to Michelle also.
Right. And as
Link
far
to
as,
that.
I think this is public knowledge, Eric told me that, I mean, with 90, it's like 98% of the towns and cities in Massachusetts are part of this flood insurance.
All but 10.
All but 10. And those 10 are mostly in Western Mass, I assume.
Yep.
So there are 10 communities who are not are not going this route, but to the rest of us, this is a big deal. Excellent. Well, I know we went a few minutes over. This has been super helpful. I mean, great questions asked, folks. Hopefully your head isn't spinning as much as mine was when I first learned of this. We'll probably have some follow-up conversations as we get closer to this. Eric, we'd love, of course, to have you or Joy back anytime.
Okay.
This floodplain administrator thing's a big deal for some of our communities and some of our conservation agents who might be tasked with doing this requirement. So we might have some follow-up in terms of how do we learn and train on this.
Yeah, Joy, I just asked Joy for this information and she provided me the slide deck of her floodplain administrator training that she gave the day before I asked her about it. So I think it would be great if MSMCP could get her to provide that training, with advanced warning.
Yes. And I'm curious with who's left on the call. Raise your hand if you think you're going to be tasked as a floodplain administrator. Does anyone know? So Jen Steele's definitely being tasked. I see Joe's being tasked. So certainly a couple people on this call, and probably some of you don't know yet. Maybe. I'm a maybe at this point, trying to hold out. Karen, are you a floodplain administrator?
No, the town manager. I think they don't want me to be.
So we're going to have a support group of conservation agents who are floodplain managers or wannabes. Karen, you could join that group too.
Yeah, I think people just aren't understanding what it entails.
Yeah. And I don't think we didn't really understand what it entails yet until we start to really do a deep dive. John, did you have any thoughts on Burlington?
I'm not the floodplain manager. The inspector of buildings is, but I've taken on doing the bylaw.
Oh, okay.
Well, one of the big responsibilities of the floodplain administrator is data collection. And if you're not already collecting data on, how many development projects or what development projects are going on in floodplains, and are now having to rope in some that you wouldn't have had to rope in before. I'm wondering about, is every patio, is that considered paving? Fences, that's one that people have talked about, and sheds and other things that would otherwise qualify for exemptions under the wetlands might otherwise qualify for exemptions. I mean, but actually, truthfully, they're not exempt in floodplain, come to think of it.
Yeah.
How do we capture what data needs to be captured? How do we capture that in a way that will be useful?
And you can certainly see the importance of doing that, right? The fact that so many of these communities aren't really capturing some of
it's important. It's important to capture the projects. I don't know who's going to do what with the data, honestly. Yeah, Eric, were you?
I was just going to say, in most situations, something like a patio would not likely have a negative impact on any kind of floodplain issue, but it's something that should be looked at, documented, and and approved, if appropriate.
I look at it similar to kind of now. I mean, people say they're doing a minor project. Usually you do some type of administrative review just to check and make sure.
Yeah. So
this would be similar, because I think the big piece is just making sure they're not filling, changing the grade.
Or obstructing flow. So
Right.
we in Newton have a fences in floodplains policy about openness and perpendicularity and all of that. So and elevating the bottom and so on. So but you know, are we currently recording all of that data in one neat place to hand off to someone else? Not.
And then that usually defeats the point of why they want to. Usually they want to enclose something like a pet.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we have a pet water wings policy. Actually, we find that much more effective, much less land disturbance.
All right. Well, that sort of like sums up a good segue to ending this presentation.
Thank you. Shut up, Jennifer. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'll sign off now.
So
Thanks, Eric.
Yes, so thank you, Eric, again. We'll be sending lots of good resources that Eric will provide to me, along with the recording. So if you need to share this even with someone else in your department that might become a floodplain administrator, it might be useful. And we'll probably do some follow-ups as we learn more as well. But thanks again. And again, we are holding another MSMCP event. I think it's next Wednesday. We're doing an in-person Wild Edibles talk with Russ Cohen. So hopefully some of you are signed up for that. And we will be in touch. Make sure your email address is on my Google sheet. And Eric, I'll send you the attendance sheet after this talk as well. So thanks, everyone.
Bye.